Camp Ashraf residents were promised protection under the Fourth Geneva Convention by senior U.S. commanders in the aftermath of the liberation of Iraq as we kicked out Saddam Hussein. Sovereignty was turned over to the Baghdad government in 2004, and with it the transfer of responsibility for Camp Ashraf. When our congressional delegation discussed this situation with Iraq's Prime Minister Maliki in Baghdad last month, his authority to govern, and the sovereignty of the people of Iraq over their territory was not an issue. We in no way quarreled with that. How the Iraqi government exercises its authority, however, is a matter of grave concern. The use of excessive force, murder, massacres, and other such tactics is an illegitimate use of force on the face of it. What happened on April 8th was an excessive use of force. It was an illegitimate use of power on its face. Using troops and armored vehicles against unarmed civilians conjures up memories of Tiananmen Square in communist China, not the kind of democratic rule that Americans have fought so long and hard, that we have dedicated such of our own blood and treasure to try to create a more democratic society. It certainly isn't reflected in what happened at Camp Ashraf on April 8th. The wholesale murder of unarmed refugees simply cannot be ignored. After the attack, the State Department asserted that the, quote, crisis and loss of life was initiated by the government of Iraq and the Iraqi military, end of quote. But what about before the attack? Was the U.S. Embassy or the commander of U.S. forces in Iraq notified of the Iraqi military buildup outside the camp or of their intentions? Was the Iraqi government contacted? Did they contact us? If so, what was the response? What response did we give them? And what was the Iraqi response if we questioned them? Why was a United States unit deployed at Camp Ashraf ordered away just hours before the attack? We would like to have asked the State Department these questions. We'd have liked them to have had a witness here, an official that could have talked to us about this and been on the record in answering these important questions. But we were told that no one was available to testify today at this hearing. How convenient. This stonewalling can only go so far before it becomes a cover-up. And yes, illegalities, not just of the Iraqi military, who murdered civilians, who committed a massacre, but of the acquiescence by the United States and the United States officials in this crime is part of the story. Covering up wrongdoing is itself illegal. A second issue of concern is whether the Maliki government acted in concert with the Iranian dictatorship. Prime Minister Maliki's political party is based on support from the Shiite community of Iraq. And, of course, the Shiite community of Iraq has, in some kind, a mutual relationship with the Shiite mullah dictatorship in Tehran. Maliki's majority in the parliament depends on the political bloc that's controlled by Mr. al-Sadr, an open agent of Tehran, and whose Mahdi militia has often clashed with U.S. forces. Is the Camp Ashraf massacre a signal of even a larger problem? Is this something that has resulted in the fact that we are seeing a willingness on the part of the government of Iraq, of Prime Minister Maliki and his majority, to do the bidding of the mullah dictatorship next door? Well, if something like that is happening, and this is the reason why Iraqi military forces felt compelled to go into Camp Ashraf and massacre its residents, maybe this calls into question the entire purpose of America's involvement in Iraq to begin with. Has America spent its blood and treasure only to allow a government to come to power in Baghdad that is a puppet of the Iranian mullah dictatorship? Now, we have much to learn today. What really happened on April 8th? Can we continue to protect Camp Ashraf? What is the solution? Should the residents be relocated to safe areas outside of Iraq? What is the solution? That's an interesting question for us to talk about today as well. I would be interested in hearing suggestions from the panel that we are about to happen.
A full, fair, and independent investigation will provide for the best means of finding a final determination of what happened, and will allow anyone found responsible to be brought to justice and help prevent future attacks. I look forward to hearing the insights of the witnesses here today regarding the human rights abuses, but also how we protect from future abuses. In 2003, the residents of Camp Ashraf had protected status under the Geneva Convention, and pursuant to the Status as a Forces Agreement between the U.S. and Iraqi governments, jurisdiction of the camp has been under Iraqi jurisdiction since 2009. With the drawdown of U.S. forces in Iraq, I believe that the UN or other independent body be given access to the camp to assess the humanitarian situation there. I'd also like to have the panel address the issues with regard to relocation of the residents. Is that an option or is it not? And also to look at the broader implications to U.S. policy as we shift from military to a State Department-led effort focusing on diplomacy and development. With that, I'm going to submit the balance of my opening for the record so we can shift our time for the witnesses. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Appreciate the ranking member's comments, and likewise I was with Chairman Rohrbacher and the ranking member on our trip to Iraq on June the 11th. We did visit with Maliki, discussed many issues with him, and one of those issues was we wanted to go to Camp Ashraf and get the resident side of what happened to them and the camp in April. After almost 2 hours of talking, and a lot of talk, as the statement has sometimes been said, when all is said and done, more is said than done, we were not allowed to go to Camp Ashraf. He was adamant about that, and we respected his decision since he was in charge of the nation. But my question then and now is still the same. Why not? What did Maliki have to hide? If he was right in about his position, and he articulated his position, I thought, quite well, why couldn't he be open-minded enough to let us get the viewpoint from the residents that lived in Camp Ashraf? And he denied us that access to those people. So it seems to me he had plenty to hide, is the reason we weren't allowed to go to Camp Ashraf and hear from the residents. When the Iraqi soldiers stormed Camp Ashraf on April the 8th, fired at the residents and ran them over with American Humvees, 36 were killed, including women and children. It was a human rights atrocity, and the U.S., with thousands of troops still fighting for peace in Iraq, has done more than little more than issue just a statement. It's not conducted its own investigation, hasn't asked the UN to investigate, and there is no point in the Iraqi government investigating the attack because they are the ones who ordered the attack. They certainly are going to find no fault with the action of their own military. A week after the attack, a letter with 18 members of of the House to Secretary Clinton and Secretary Gates, asking them to shed some light on this violent attack. It is now July. To date, there is blissful silence from the administration and have given us no answer for this inhumane attack of Iraq on the people of Iraq. I guess they are too busy bombing Libya in the name of humanity to get back with us. Instead, the administration has proposed a new relocation plan for the camp. They want to move the camp to some other location within Iraq. This is the same plan the Iranians themselves proposed years ago. We have heard how dangerous this would be to the residents of the camp. In May, I sent a letter to Secretary Clinton opposing this misguided plan. Camp Ashraf is recognized around the world as a refuge for those who oppose the Iranian regime. And if we move it within Iraq, they will lose that public recognition while leaving residents under the same control of the Army. There's something directly under our control that we can do, and that is we can take the MEK off the foreign terrorist organization list. One of the obstacles in moving Camp Ashraf to a peaceful third country is that they are still designated as terrorists by the United States. I've introduced a bipartisan legislation, HRES 60, that urges the Secretary of State to take the MEK off the foreign terrorist organization list. I have seen and been in all the classified briefings that I know of regarding the MEK, and I am not convinced that they should remain on the list. The State Department has not made their case to keep them on the list, therefore they should be removed. The MEK should not be used as a political tool to appease any dictators in the world. 83 of my colleagues agree with me. As a nation, we've promised to protect these Iranian individuals. No matter what we think of the MEK, we should all agree that no group, especially one that has given up terrorism and given up all of its weapons, deserves to have its human rights trampled on by Iraq or Iran or anyone else. We have given Iraq a democracy and freedom. It's time they start acting like they deserve it and provide safety for Camp Ashraf residents and the MEK. And I will yield to the gentleman, Mr. Filner, for his opening statement.
I think, and I appreciate your efforts, Mr. Rohrbacher's efforts, Mr. Carnahan's efforts to make America more aware of this. This is going to hit us, Mr. Poe, I think you know. As the American pullout occurs of Iraq, after all our treasure of money and men and women who have died and been injured there, do we want the Iranians to take over? And yet that is a potential. Ashraf is a symbol of what we, I think, need to prevent. After all this intervention in Iraq in a decade, the Iranians come in. The MEK favors a non-nuclear, democratic, secular regime. I think that's something we can all agree to. And I look forward to testimony. Thank you, Mr.